with no further ado, I'm going to introduce the panel from left to right. Most of you know this gentleman, Kirby Raycraft from NSCC. Some of you may or may not know that Kirby was instrumental in getting BIM added to the curriculum at NSCC. So again, a pioneer in this region, and we need more people like Kirby. Duncan from Construction Association of Nova Scotia. Many of you probably know Duncan. In my time getting to know Duncan over the last year or so, he is an arduous worker, doing everything he can for his membership to help them understand how important BIM is to their world. So it was very important that we have Duncan on this panel. And Samantha-Rodrigues Machado. Did I say that right?
Correct.
That's a good Irish name, right? There we go. From NSTIR. Samantha was brave enough to join us because we've been pounding on them to try and get them to participate. And as much as they dodged and weaved, I think Samantha was the last one standing. So we're very happy to have her on the board. Mr. James Foran from Dalhousie University. For many of you who did their architectural programs there, James, I'm not sure how long you've been at Dal, but some of you probably know him quite well.
I've been there for a year and a half, so.
All right, so maybe you don't know. We'll get to that. And the last individual that I corralled into joining our panel as a little quid pro quo, Chris and I did a presentation at Sense AGM last week, and I cornered Nick. He's the outgoing president of Sense, and I said, Nick, we need you on the board, on the panel. So Nick just enthusiastically said, yes, why didn't you call me sooner? But he agreed to join us. All right. We're going to jump right into the questions. I've got a really loaded question for the panel to start. It's kind of a three-part question, and I'm going to launch into that right now. As I said, they've all had an opportunity to consider their responses. We'll move through that, and I've got some other questions, but I'm hoping at that point in time we'll have generated enough dialogue to create some interest from the audience to pose some questions. So, the first question for our panelists is, it's a three-part. What is your understanding of what BIM is? And by definition isn't. What impact has it had in your field? And how important is it to the regional and national dialogue? So, what's your impression of what BIM is? What impact has it had in your field? And how important is this dialogue to the regional and national landscape? So, I'm going to turn to my first panelist on the left, Kirby. Go right ahead.
I don't know. Okay, good. It's on. First question. What is BIM? I know what BIM isn't. It's not just Revit. And I'm as guilty as anybody of making that mistake in the beginning. The effect on my particular industry education is to properly educate the concepts behind, in this case, BIM. I almost beginning to hate the word BIM, just because it's being used as a catch-all phrase for 3D modeling, and it's not that. It's a process. It's understanding that we're not just talking about replicating a design in a single file or a limited number of files. And as an educator, because curriculum is continually changing and updating, the onus is on us as the educators to make sure that our graduates are educated in that. How many times can I use the word educate? As far as on the third question, about the national scale, provincial scale, the industry in general is not solely one company anymore. There's so much collaboration, and whether it's within the city, within the province, within the country, and internationally, and the collaboration aspects. I always have to talk from a software background, unfortunately. The collaboration aspects are so important, and the understanding of how that works is very important. So.
Excellent. Thank you, Kirby. Any questions for Kirby? All right, Duncan.
I certainly concur with what Kirby said. I think over and above the process, it's also about a philosophy and a culture of collaboration, and sophisticated owners around the world are looking more and more for the ability not only to design on time, on budget, and save costs up front, but also look at the life cycle of the project. I went to a presentation at Disney, believe it or not, and it was called Disney Does BIM, and the way they described how they use the philosophy, the culture, and of course the supporting technology was pretty impressive. And they were able to show clearly the money they saved up front, the rework and change orders that they reduced up front was pretty dramatic. If you look at the scale of the projects that Disney would build, you wouldn't think, you know, a ride would be that complicated until you start looking underneath the ground, and that's where the real work is. And for them, they're talking in terms of hundreds of millions of dollars. So 15–20% savings were huge. In terms of the scale across the country, I don't even think that we're talking just about Canada. I think we're talking about the world globally. We all hear global competition is here. It is, and I think it's going to accelerate even more. If you look at the European Union agreements that are being signed, you've got UK firms that have been doing this for 20 years. They're very sophisticated at using BIM, again, the technology, the culture, and the philosophy that goes behind it. And I think it would behoove ourselves not to start to work closer as an industry and as a community to prepare for that level of competition that's going to come into here. And I think, you know, we have to really do a little bit of soul searching here to say what is it that we're not doing and what is it we need to be doing so that we're ready to compete on a global basis.
Excellent. Any questions for Duncan? I have a question for Duncan that I'm just going to, before we get to Samantha, and this is a little bit of a background question. Where do you see the easiest point of entry for your membership to start engaging with BIM?
You're going to ask me a really hard question. You know what, we're really fortunate here. We've got great universities, we've got a great college system, we've got some of the best infrastructure in terms of education, in my opinion, anywhere in the country. I think we have a great opportunity to start training our new talent, obviously, but also to re-engage the talent that's been out there in the field for a number of years and re-engage them in a systematic way across all of those institutions. And I don't think it has to be a competitive situation where one university is competing against a college or vice versa. I think it's going to have to take collaborative approach from all of those institutions to bring the best and the brightest together, because we've got a lot of ground to make up. And I think you know, we probably should start now versus waiting too much longer, so that we do put those systems in play. You know, I think we also need to look at our own secondary education system. I've sat on a panel with the Department of Education a little while ago, and one of the things we were talking about was getting our kids ready for a very different world than what we're all used to. One where mathematics is not an option. You know, and the deputy minister had a habit of saying, we spend an inordinate amount of time on hockey and sports, yet we spend very little time in mathematics. And I can't say that I disagree with her when I look at my own time with my kids. And I think we have to prepare, so the entry point has to start much earlier, and I'm talking grade 6, grade 5. I know that may sound a little crazy, but we have a whole generation to start turning around in terms of embracing technology and innovation.
Excellent, thank you, Duncan. Just a side question to that. What do you see as the barriers, you know, to making that happen? Both from that angle and also from your own membership. I mean, you and I chatted, and you know, you said to me at times that even your own membership isn't, you know, fully on board, shall we say. So I see that as a bit of an obstacle. So, you know, how are we going to overcome those? You know, what do you think it's going to take to get more of your members going, yeah, we get it?
All right, I'm going to offend probably everybody in the room over the next 3 minutes, so I apologize ahead of time. Right now, we've got a very, in my humble opinion, and what I've seen in the last 6 years, we've got a very disjointed community when it comes to the conversation around building information management. And that's not to dismiss the fact there's a lot of collaboration happening, but I think it's happening in a very traditional way, which is great. but I think we have the upper game in terms of collaboration. You know, we also have to look at the fact that investment-wise and cost-wise, for most of our members, probably 70% of them, they're under 20 employees. And the balance are under 100, and the last 5% are over 100 employees. So for those firms, it's a big investment, not only in just the technology and the computers and the hardware and such, but in the people and the skills and the time commitment to do that and bring those expertise on, especially in a smaller market like we're in, you know, where those projects right now are fewer and far between than probably will be in 5 years. Justifying that expense is certainly a challenge, I think, for a lot of our firms. So I think that's a huge barrier. I think we need to work with vendors. I think we need a more cost-effective, scalable model that will enable small firms to make that investment but not have to break the bank to do it. And you know, I'm not going to pick on any particular software provider, but I think we really have to take a hard look at the business model that's being used and scale it so that it is right-sized for our market. You know, there are some big numbers that are being thrown around in terms of the initial upfront investment, and I think they're out of reach for a lot of our firms. You know, and a plug for ourselves, we want to build a BIM lab so that, and work with the universities and the college system so that we can take those smaller companies and train them, that they don't have to make a huge investment in hardware, software, etc. But we're going to have to bring all the parties together to do that. I think one of the other barriers, of course, there's a belief it's snuffleupagus. You know, I've said this many times. Nobody sees it, so it doesn't exist. And my biggest fear, and I've gone on record many times with our board of directors and with our membership, I do my best, and my belief as the association president is that we should be trying to at least lead you to the trough. I can't make you drink, but I certainly won't be looked at in 5 years or 10 years and say, why didn't you say anything? We've been saying it for 6 years. And again, I go back to beat a dead horse. The economic conditions we're operating under right now are going to change pretty dramatically in the next few years, in my opinion, with the signing of the Pacific Rim agreements, European Union agreements. You know, those firms are ready to come in here. Canada has been named as one of the top 5 construction markets by 2020. And if you think we're not going to get global attention, think again. We're already seeing hollowing out when I talk to the architecture community, and smaller firms are either becoming very small or they're becoming much larger. You know, and the same thing is happening in construction. There's lots of consolidation happening. And you know, that's part of the business cycle. But I think we have to get our heads out of the sand. It's not snuffleupagus, and it is around. I think one of the other barriers, and I guess one of the final couple of points I'd make is, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? So, you know, we've talked many times, David, about the fact that owners are not asking for it, therefore contractors are not preparing for it. Contractors are not preparing for it because owners are not asking for it. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, and I think this is the type of forum where that discussion starts to happen. What are the steps that we need to put in place so that it's not one side or the other saying hurry up and get it done, versus how do we start to take steps as an industry, design, engineering, contracting, you name it, everybody party to the project. How do we start taking those baby steps to get us prepared and move in tandem so that nobody is cliche but left behind, I guess. One of the other barriers, of course, is standardization of the platforms. That's a very basic thing, and there's obvious reasons why there are a number of platforms. It's proprietary and competitive advantage programming and such, but we need to start moving towards standardization. And we also need to resolve the conversation around who owns designs. I had a conversation on my way in here, actually, with one of our bigger contractors who you know, does a lot of great work in this region, but gets stonewalled, if you will, when they ask for the 3D designs, and they're prepared to work in this environment, but they get a lot of resistance from the design community. So I think we have to get past that discussion. We had it in probably 1981, I think, when AutoCAD was introduced first. So I think we need to start getting beyond that, and I can't tell you how to do that, but I do believe we have to get beyond that conversation, and we need to do it sooner rather than later.
Awesome. Thank you, Duncan. Moving right along, Samantha, question. What is your understanding of BIM? What impact has it in your field or office, and how important is it to the regional and national dialogue? So let's start with what is BIM for you?
For me, I would say it's a tool that facilitates not only visualization of program elements or maxing elements, but it's also a really good coordination tool. When we have, and I'm going to speak particularly of one of my projects, is when we do school designs. Having a consultant that is working in BIM facilitates many, many different things. And one of them is a coordination aspect of the project. My job as an architect is really just coordinating the project, and I'm also involved in the planning aspect of the school. So when we have those earlier models where we start looking at adjacencies and we start looking at different elements and program components, we can confirm whether they are working in the spaces that they're working. Of course, you could argue, or many people argue, well, you can do that in SketchUp. Sure, we can do that in any program. However, with the BIM structure, the fact that this model starts growing in information and could go to up to a level where at the end of the day it gives us information in terms of useful facilities management or facilities coordination aspects that we can later use once the building is built, is what I feel is the most valuable of this particular system, or not system, but this particular BIM. When we have just drawings and when we just have, let's say, like a SketchUp model, it has a limit. It stops at a certain aspect. With BIM, we can go to different levels of information throughout the project, all the way to the end, and actually use this model after the fact, when we're actually running the building. Now, do we do that today? Are we there? I don't think so. Especially TIR, we don't have the information. And I'm not an owner rep, I'm more a consultant to the owners, to the Department of Education, to the Department of Justice, Health. We are not owners. We're more like the consultant person. So for us, it would be very important to actually have that information so that we can let our clients know, well, if we're doing BIM, we can get this level, and this level, and this level of information at the end of the day for your projects. We don't have that yet. We don't have the information to start that process. So I feel that we are still kind of in diapers. I think that my group, particularly, we know and we understand the value. And I think we're progressively going there. We are moving towards that ideal. What was the other question, sorry?
Well, what's been the impact in your field or
yes.
office? But I'm actually going to take you a little sideways here for a moment.
Yeah, sure.
And this is really a question that helps, I think, certainly myself and maybe others, is in your capacity as a consultant and project manager working with your major clients, Nova Scotia Health, Department of Education, is there a place for TIR to provide guidance and leadership to their customers to say, we'd like to start talking about doing things this way? I guess where I'm personally going with that is, you know, if we're waiting for the clients to come to you and say, hey, we heard about this great thing called BIM, can we start talking about doing a project in that? Personally, I'd love to see a situation, and I don't know if your mandate allows that, but where TIR takes a leadership role, communicates with their customers and say, we think there's a better way to do this. So when you're thinking about your projects, so is there room for that in the TIR mandate?
Absolutely, and I must say that myself, I'm one of those architects that, as a design lead, with my consultants, the ones that are actually working with BIM, I'm able to do that with my client. I'm able to show them physically with my pad or my phone, okay, we can go into your building at this stage, at this level of information, and this is what it looks like. Oh, but I don't understand what the mechanical and electrical is doing. Well, let's look at it, and then we can actually see it physically. So I'm able to convey that importance and the value of this, definitely. And I think that that's what we are, at least that's what I'm moving towards, yeah,
So
in our group.
Be the change you want to see?
Yeah,
Excellent. Just a little short on time, so Samantha, we're going to jump over now to,
Sure.
To James Foran, Dalhousie School of Architecture and Planning. James, your thoughts?
All right, thanks. Oh, well, thanks for having me here. It's really great. It's great to kind of meet a lot of members of the industry here. So I'm really pleased to be here. And I just also want to give you some context because I'm new here as to where I'm coming from. I'm basically have probably 8 or 9 years in practice in Boston. And basically in a kind of computation and high performance building systems capacity. So working with BIM in terms of complex geometries and enclosure and structural systems. And now I'm teaching design technology at Dal, both in terms of computation, fabrication, building systems integration, and design. So just to kind of give you my frame of reference. In terms of what BIM is, I was doing some thinking on this and looking at the Augie forum last night and just seeing like what people were writing about it. And there is interesting hearing, the earlier comments about the tool versus the process, and BIM is a tool and process, and there's these discussions going on in there. And I think my interest is in the process, and what BIM brings is a notion of fitness, I think, to the design process and the construction process. And what I mean by that is kind of in an evolutionary sense. So it's not bringing like a kind of idealized model of what it can be, but through a series of steps, through a series of problems, the way you set things up, almost in an evolutionary sense, you get to see a design migrate through a series of options into a particular mode that you're actually selecting. So I think it's a more dynamic process, and I think it allows incorporation of data, it allows incorporation of analysis into the process. So I think that's a really major shift for us as designers and constructors. And the kind of flip side of that is it's not an answer. It doesn't provide answers. It helps you set up questions, and it helps you kind of evaluate the outcomes of those questions, but the answers always lie within us, right? So we can use it to establish very routine solutions, we can use it to innovate very radically, and it's really a matter of what the user wants. And I think it's really important when we handle technology to understand that we're in command, right? That's not the technology providing us the feedback or providing us the answer. In terms of impact on the field, my biggest interest is in its impact on the imagination, both in terms of design and in terms of, I think at a more immediate level, you might think of like visualization or design creativity, which is certainly important, but also innovation in terms of project delivery, innovation in terms of thinking about how data can inform the design, innovation in terms of life cycle analysis. So, I mean, for me, one of the awesome things was when I was young and starting out, and I was first getting exposed to computation, and I think a lot of people who are really invested in technology have this moment where you're like, you start getting into the tool and your brain just explodes, right? And you're like, oh my God, I can do all this stuff with this. Whether it is about finding a more efficient way to produce documents, whatever it is, or if it's about a really amazing way to go through design options. But that moment is so critical to the profession, and I think it's something that's really important for practitioners especially to kind of hang on to and really try and drive in their practice, because that's where the value of what we do, that's where our kind of return to society comes. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, because it also can really kill the imagination if you don't invest in what excites you about the project. And then I guess finally the question about the importance of the regional and national dialogue. So I'm coming from a different region and a different nation. But I mean, I think that so I can just speak to my observations from that market, say, and corollary to I think some of the comments made earlier. I think it establishes a certain, or I've seen it establish a bit of a hierarchy in terms of the profession. So that you do get these large corporate offices, the 100+ offices that have maybe a national resource or international resources, right? Maybe come into towns and buy firms. And so those offices are really, power users. They've jumped into this technology very early on, and they're really using it to their advantage. And then it's really a matter of that fit between the size of the firm, the size of the practice, the goals of the practice, and so you get maybe smaller offices that are using it for kind of innovating in terms of fabrication technologies or innovating their design process. And I think there's always a struggle I've seen in those smaller practices about that moment of investment. What's that project that you use to launch into the BIM world? And so I think there's a kind of wrestling match that people come to with that. But one of the things I guess I do want to note on that is, again, in terms of how you imagine the tool and how you use it for an answer. One of the things that I was particularly proud of in a project I worked on was it was with a kind of large corporate firm, and we were able to use kind of BIM technology to actually reach out to local vendors, to a local fabricator who really, the system that we made was built from the ground up. It was built from basic lumber, basic steel plate stock, and that mill worker who had the capacity to work with us through BIM was able to draw on small tradespeople throughout the region, and we didn't have to go to some kind of international outside practice to realize a really kind of exciting part of the project. So again, it's just how do you work that tool? I think is a really important question.
Several years ago, I had a conversation with a professor at Dow who's now since moved on. I don't know if you had a chance to overlap with him, but Roland Hudson?
Yeah, no, Rolly's great. I've met Rolly a couple times, but yeah. We kind of handed the baton.
Oh, okay. Roland and I got halfway down an opportunity that he was trying to build a public-private BIM lab within Dalhousie University. And I suspect with Roland leaving that kind of died on the table. But a question I have for you, in terms of the art of architecture at the university level, when you're teaching architecture, are you starting to hear or feedback from your own students? They're asking to know more about BIM? Are they asking about some aspect of that being brought into the curriculum? I mean, technology, we can't do architecture today without technology. So, the colleges do a great job of teaching the software, teaching students, and so on and so forth. But at the architect level, what are you hearing from your students about, they want to know more about BIM, or flip that around, what's the university doing to proactively start to introduce that conversation into the education process?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And, the question of technology in any education is context is basically very context specific. So, Dalhousie has a particular tradition of education that maybe a different university may not come in. So you have to play on those strengths. And the students, I think, come with the awareness, the curiosity about these issues. And it's a question of how do you implement, I think, technology broadly, with BIM being a part of that. What are the steps that you take? So from one university that I taught at, basically everyone was thrown into the whole computational suite the first month. And they had a month of hand drafting, and that was it. And then they were launched into digital production. I don't necessarily think that's the right model. I don't necessarily think that's the wrong model. Dal has a very different sort of ethos, and I think we're internally kind of trying to build that sequence, and that's part of my role there, as part of Rolly's role there. And so I'm obviously trying to build on some of the traditions and actually a lot of the intelligence that he left behind. There's a number of grad students that he has there who, or he has there or had there, but who are really skilled at these tools that I'm able to draw on as well. And I think for our part, it's really again teaching the process of the technology. It's not necessarily delivering instruction on a particular tool. Because I know, and I guess what I'm thinking is that, you want, and I think any educator, I mean, even if you're, I know, like when I was in an office, like I needed to figure out a detail, and I was really young, I didn't know anything, and so they would send me to like the detail person, right, in the office who had like massive amounts of knowledge about this, and they would sit me down and they would draw through the problem, but they were really always, I mean, I think there's always an educator in every practice in different ways. I think all of us are interested in that, who walks me through the principles of the detail. They're not just telling me like how to draw the detail. They're like, you always want to think about this, you always want to think about this, oh, this is interesting. And so I think we want to develop that higher level thinking always, no matter what, no matter what environment we're teaching in. So I do see students gravitating towards, and one of the tools that I use, and I know Rolly uses is Rhino, to speak about specific platforms, and Grasshopper. And the only reason to mention those is they are, it's a good teaching tool in a way, because students are actually having to construct the logic. They're not just learning to press buttons and make a certain operation happen, but they're learning to construct the logic. And that knowledge is transferable, so that's, I think, the positive aspect of that. And some of the issues that they dive into are things like design fitness, right? So, and then that's one of Rolly's big concerns, is how do you develop a kind of process that has a series of outputs that you can select from, but also things like climate, things like life cycle, things like structural performance. So really trying to get into those issues, use them as a way to teach themselves about those issues, but also develop a different model of working through those and integrating those into the design. So that's sort of the focus in the curriculum. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it's perfect. But I'd like to pick up that conversation about that lab at some point. Thank you. That was awesome. Tobin, over to you, sir. Last but best.
Last but best, that's right. I guess, well, we all agree that BIM is a kind of a large, encompassing model that brings in the owners, maintenance staff, contractors, engineers, architects. But from the point of view of the consulting engineer, really the heart of the BIM process is in the 3D modeling, Revit, as well as the bolt-on packages that go with it for analysis, calculations, and the scanning technology that you see out there with the vendor setup out there for collecting existing conditions. Those are really the heart of the BIM process for the consulting engineering industry. And as far as impact goes, speaking as somebody who goes into the office every day with owners and shareholders, and inevitably the first question that always comes up for any company that wants to get into it is, what are the costs? There's significant costs with software upgrades, upgrading all your hardware, training, licensing, and then actually putting in the time to do the project. So I know specifically for our firm, we're more than 2 years in and still learning. So it has a big impact in that way, and then hopefully the payback that we've seen on projects and around the consulting engineering industry is certainly better coordinated drawings. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if there's a pipe going through a beam, somebody needs to figure that out. And ideally, I think everybody would agree that gets figured out during the design stage, not when things are fabricated and on site with workers. So the better coordinated drawings, interference checks, those are all the upside of the BIM process, specifically on the 3D modeling, as well as global changes. Inevitably, changes happen on every project. There are very few projects, especially if there's any significant size, that don't have changes. And when there's changes in the 2D world, it's very difficult to make all those changes to all the drawings and make sure you get everything. So that's an item that we've also noticed was a very big help, making global changes to drawings. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we want whatever best serves the client. From a regional perspective, I spend significant amounts of time in and out of many of the consulting firms around the area through my involvement with SENS. I'm in and out of them on a regular basis, and it's definitely around the region, it's the talk. Being a competitive business, not everybody wants to tip their hat as to how far along they are with things, but everybody's always trying to figure out kind of how far into the process each firm is at to try and gauge themselves, because you don't want to be the last one to the table, because it's not like one day you just flick the switch and you're moved over to a BIM process. And that's why, like Duncan had alluded to, the construction industry and the consulting engineers and architects are similar industry in that you don't want to make these large investments in technology and processes until you know that the client has an appetite for it. And so you're not going to go out and make these large investments without there being work there. And so you end up in a bit of a chicken and an egg scenario, both pointing at each other going, well, you don't have the skills to do this work, and us pointing back at them saying, well, you never asked any of us to do it, so how are we supposed to get it? And that's part of the challenge, I guess, is in that scenario is being able to actually get the work. And the other aspect is the training. It comes back to the education as well as the actual specific product training. It's if you don't use it, you lose it. And you end up in a scenario where sometimes kids are fresh out of school, they've got all the training, they've taken the training courses, and then there's no project for them to work on. And time lapses on, and all of a sudden everything gets rusty, and they basically end up going back to square one when it comes time to work on it. So we're kind of in that little bit of a state of limbo where I think from the point of view of the construction and consulting industry, I think we're looking back at the owner saying, if we really are going to make this thing go, we kind of need your support to say this is what we want, and give firms and companies a reason to really invest in it.
Excellent. That's a really good point. A really interesting conversation with Bruce McCallum over Wobbly Pops and hors d'oeuvres last night. We talked earlier about, it's not about, necessarily about this, although that tends to be, sometimes the dynamic of what's going on. My own personal feeling is that if it all starts with the owners, and that's where we need to create the demand, awareness, and the forward momentum. Bruce had a really interesting and a very different tact on that, and it's something that Ray Gallant and I talked about a long time ago. And I know traditional procurement methods make this really difficult to do, but the thought was, let's get a bunch of consultancy structures together, approach an owner, and say, let's do a project together where we'll put our money on the line, we'll put our risk on the line to show you that by doing projects this way, and I'm not necessarily referring to IPD, but leveraging the benefits of BIM and so on and so forth, let's do a project together. Now, we don't like to have that conversation with the public owner, using traditional design, bid, build, procurement methodologies, but somehow if we can find a framework, a dialogue to have with an owner and do this, then we're going to prove it, we're going to demonstrate it to you, we're going to show you value. So if we could all kind of noodle on that, I'd love to have a conversation with others about how do we approach owners and get them to have that, where they've got a traditional procurement methodology that would prohibit that. Well, we can't just pick. Let's find a way to do it, whether it's a big ceiling that allows an owner to do that. But that was a really good conversation with Bruce, and that is that we as an industry, as I said earlier, we need to be the change that we want to see. Well, let's find a way to approach owners and see if we can get them interested in the dialogue around doing that, where they wouldn't necessarily be in a position to do that if it's a public entity. So, excellent point. We've got about 7 minutes left. I would love to see some questions from the audience. So we've got a really great panel here. Some of them are going to be here for the rest of the day, so we'll be able to talk to them at break. I know Duncan's got to head out very, very shortly, so if you got some questions for Duncan, I'd squeeze them in now, but I got crickets. We got a question from Mr. Ford.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Foran. Just a quick question for Kirby, just to kick things off and get people asking more questions. Curious to know, from your perspective, how many firms, how many companies, how many businesses are approaching you demanding BIM-enabled students? Are you feeling movement in that direction, or is it still, status quo?
How many companies are coming to us requesting? The only exposure we see is typically from our program advisory committee, and there are a select number of members of that. But when we speak with them, we ask the question, what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? When it came to the subject of BIM, the topic usually is more about, we've introduced Revit. Is that a good thing? Or is that something you don't want. And usually it comes to is a positive response, because Revit is seen as BIM in a more potentially efficient way of producing drawings. But straight out and out industry coming to us, no.
Yeah, there's a bit of a telltale sign there as well. All right, we're under 5 minutes. I saw a question over there somewhere.
Hi, Ian from Canada. This is more of a comment I've heard a couple times, the difficulty for smaller companies to adopt due to overhead and that sort of thing. It should be known that there's other resources to help make that happen. There's federal government grants. Coming from a startup myself, we've partnered with educational institutions to take advantage of insert grants and adoption. Like we've obviously adopted BIM platforms a long time ago, but newer technologies there's some risk there or uncertainty, we can partner with a university or a college that has access to these insert grants and offer a small contribution. We get a lot back for that money though. So there's other avenues to do that. It's not always a full burden on the firm itself. And the other thing is the smaller companies are the ones that have the most adaptability. They're the most nimble organizations that can change quickly. So they are the ones that can really make the difference, I think. And just my own experience in doing that, it just should be known that don't be afraid to make that leap. I mean, there's other resources out there to help you along.
I think we're on a trajectory, given the comments that James Warren made and the fact that there has been a curriculum here at NSCC. I mean, we're on this trajectory that at some point in time it's going to become, this is how we do things, right? Just like we do things today based on, old methods of process, old tools. I was in the channel for 8 years, and this isn't an advertisement for the channel, but I think, and the folks from Autodesk are here, and Ben was here, I'd say the same thing. I think they're starting to make adjustments in their pricing models that somewhat reduce the barrier to entry around the cost of acquiring the software. Before, it was big, expensive perpetual licenses, and they started bundling them all together. Some of that's changing. So for any of you in the room, if you got some time, spin by the audit or the Imaginate booth, have a conversation. You might learn a few things that will surprise you about how that started to come down. Duncan's talked extensively about developing a BIM lab within the Construction Association. There's a precedent for that around Canada. There's a number of construction associations that have done that for a while. We'll do everything we can to help Duncan get that off the ground as well, as well as getting support from the government to help fund that, because it's a fundamental element to create a more competitive environment for our membership. I did that with beer last night. Mr. Gallant.
This is kind of for Samantha. I want to commend you first on TIR's new specifications for the schools that I think you were talking about, where you do see coordination under the trade contractors' perspectives, which is nice to see. I guess, what's your vision for the facilities management and serviceability and service side of the schools and government facilities that are coming out? Because obviously you started the BIM process, it's in the spec. What are we going to do to continue that into the actual operation of the buildings?
That's an excellent question. That is actually one of the things that we are moving towards, or the reasons why we're moving towards this BIM process, because one of the things that we are hearing more and more from the owners is that they need not just the record drawings, not just O&M manuals, to be complete, to be handed into TIR, as we request in our contracts, but also they're not demanding yet because they don't have all the information, but they are learning and understanding that there is something out there with this model of information that they can actually coordinate and manage the facilities operation-wise. Like, for example, analysis of mechanical systems. Let's say plumbing fixtures that they have, and have the specific information of what was in that building in this one model. So right now, we're still, like I said, in diapers, unfortunately, in terms of the information that we have. But that there is an understanding that this can get us there, and that can facilitate that once the building is built and once we start operating the building. And we can take this model, look at it. Of course, if the model has been developed to that level, if it has that level of information, they can actually not go through a whole bunch of set of binders, but it's all in there. It's all in that model. So, yeah, the understanding is there. It's just that the information, complete information, is not. But we are looking at that nowadays.
That is really encouraging to hear. I didn't know that had showed up in the new standards. We're out of time, but I promised Kirby. I know there was another question on the floor, but yeah, we're going to be around all day. Kirby has something he'd like to share with us.
Well, I don't share it, but to be absolutely honest, in the Nova Scotia Community College, as far as curriculum is concerned, at this point in time, BIM is minimal. There are selected courses that do incorporate BIM concepts, but over the next 5 years, I foresee a fairly significant change as far as BIM content in the curriculum. And I wanted to throw it out there to everybody here who has any thoughts as to what you would like to see incorporated into that curriculum with respect to BIM. What are you doing now that you feel is important, that is relevant to the process? I hope to, well, we don't really have a community of BIM users per se, not an official one anyway in the province. And I think that's one goal, is to sort of create I hate to use the word users group because that brings us back to software, but a community of users who can come together and share information. But from a curriculum point of view, each year we undergo changes in curriculum, and like, as I said, over the next, say, 5 years-ish, I want to see a significant change in that as far as incorporating. So after the session, during the breaks, feel free to come up to me or send me an email and with any thoughts. There's no guarantees, but it's good to hear what people are doing. Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Pietro.
Dave, man, just add something. With respect to what Kirby just mentioned, Kit Ferrari, Canada Education Committee, I'd like to say today, I think for the first time announcing it, ourselves and Building Smart Canada are actually forming a team. We've actually signed, we're going to be signing an MOU very shortly, where we will address exactly what Kirby just mentioned. So whatever comes forward from what Kirby said, on behalf of CanBIM and Building Smart Canada, I'd like to invite all of you to either feed it to Kirby, feed it to us, and our plan is to really put together a strong strategy in unison moving forward from coast to coast. And we've identified gaps. We will move forward very quickly. So whatever you can convey to Kirby or to us, we will very gladly work on it together as a team in terms of the education component.
Excellent.
Thanks.
One of the first topics I'd love to see added to that curriculum, because we all know one of the greatest benefits of BIM is for the facility owner during the life cycle, that facility management stage. So, as far as the curriculum is concerned, I'd love to see a very meaningful portion of that to include BIM for FN, and why that's so important, because that's where all your major costs are. All right, panelists, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. As I said, they're all going to be around this afternoon or today, except for Duncan. I know he's in the middle of moving offices, so I think he's got some boxes to shift around. Thank you again, everybody. Really appreciate your time and effort.
Thank you.
All right.